I still remember the sound of my son's voice that afternoon, not crying, not yelling, just quiet in a way that terrified me more than screams ever could. It was the sound of something breaking inside a child who didn't yet have the words to explain what had been taken from him. I was folding laundry when he walked through the door. His backpack slid off his shoulder and landed on the floor with a dull thud. He didn't run to the kitchen like he usually did. He didn't ask for a snack. He didn't even look up at me. Clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. That was when I knew something was wrong. Before this story continues, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment "I stand with him" if you believe children deserve respect and protection. I asked him how his day was. My voice was gentle, careful not to scare whatever fragile thing was holding him together. He shrugged. That alone felt like a punch to my chest. My son never shrugged. He talked. He told stories. He reenacted his entire day with dramatic flair. But that day, there was nothing. I knelt in front of him and lifted his chin with 2 fingers. I asked. He shook his head. Nothing. Children lie differently than adults. Their lies are clumsy, desperate. They lie not to deceive, but to survive. And in that moment, I realized my son wasn't trying to hide something from me. He was trying to protect himself from reliving it. I didn't push. I pulled him into my arms instead. He hesitated for half a second, then collapsed against me. His body shook, small shoulders trembling against my chest. My mind already bracing for whatever truth was about to come out. "It was my teacher," he whispered. "Those 4. Teachers were supposed to be safe. Teachers were supposed to be the adults who noticed when kids were struggling, who lifted them up, who protected them when parents weren't there." That's what I believed. That's what I had trusted. "What about your teacher?" I asked carefully. He pulled back just enough to look at me. Whether I would believe him. Whether I would still love him if what he said next sounded small or silly. "She laughed at me," he said. I felt my stomach drop. "In class," he added. Everyone heard. I sat down on the couch, pulling him with me, my arms still wrapped around his small frame. I asked him to tell me everything slowly, from the beginning. I promised I wouldn't interrupt. I promised I wouldn't get angry, at least not outwardly. Inside, something dark and furious was already waking up. He told me how he had raised his hand to answer a question. How he had always struggled a little with reading out loud, how words sometimes tangled themselves up in his mouth even though he knew the answer in his head. How he tried anyway, because he wanted to be brave. He told me how the room went quiet as he stumbled over a sentence, and then he told me how his teacher sighed loudly and said, "We don't have all day." Can anyone who actually knows how to read help him? My hands tightened around him. He told me how a few kids laughed, how some looked down at their desks, how no one said anything, how the teacher shook her head and muttered something about kids who should be in special classes. "She said it in front of everyone," he whispered. And then she made me sit down. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest burned, my throat tightened, and for a moment, I had to fight the urge to scream. At the idea that an adult entrusted with my child's care could do something so cruel, and then move on with her day, as if nothing had happened. "What did you do after that?" I asked. He shrugged again. I didn't talk anymore. That was when the real fear set in. Children don't always tell you when something breaks inside them. Sometimes they just go quiet. Sometimes they decide that being invisible is safer than being brave. And once that lesson is learned, it can take years to unlearn it, if it ever is. That night he barely touched his dinner. He pushed food around his plate, his eyes distant. When I asked him if he wanted dessert, he shook his head. When I asked him if he wanted to watch his favorite show, he said he was tired. He went to bed early. I sat on the edge of his bed and brushed his hair back from his forehead like I had done 1,000 times before. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of one moment had shrunk him. "Did you tell anyone at school?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "Please don't tell them either." There it was, the fear. He was afraid that speaking up would make it worse. He'd be punished. afraid that the teacher would get angrier, afraid that the laughter would come back, louder this time. I promised him I wouldn't do anything without talking to him first. That I would protect him. That he was safe. But inside, I was already making a different promise to myself. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and stared at a blank screen. I searched the school's website. I read the mission statement, the anti-bullying policy, the words about safe learning environments and respect for every student. They felt hollow now. I replayed my son's words over and over in my head. I imagined him standing there, heart pounding, trying to be brave. His voice was careful, like he already knew the answer and was bracing himself for disappointment. "Yes," I said softly. "But I'll be right here when you get home." He nodded, though his shoulders slumped. I hated that I couldn't follow him inside. I hated that I couldn't sit next to him in class and shield him from words that could scar him for life. When he came home that afternoon, he said nothing about school. Nothing good, nothing bad, just fine. That was when I knew this wasn't over. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. He stopped raising his hand at home when we practiced reading. He started asking me to read for him instead. He flinched when I gently corrected a mistake. He apologized constantly for things that didn't need apologies. "I'm sorry I'm slow," he said once quietly. That sentence shattered me. I emailed the school, requesting a meeting. Polite, calm, carefully worded. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply said my son had come home upset and mentioned an incident in class that concerned me. The response took 3 days. When it finally came, it was short, vague, professional to the point of coldness. They thanked me for reaching out and said they would look into the matter. Nothing changed. My son came home one afternoon and said, "She doesn't call on me anymore." Another day, he said, "She told me to stop asking questions." I began keeping notes, dates, exact words, changes in behavior, sleepless nights, stomachaches before school. The way he chewed his nails until they bled. Something in me hardened, not into anger alone, but into resolve, because this wasn't just about one cruel comment. This was about power. About how easily a child could be made to feel small by someone who would never face consequences unless someone forced them to. And I was done being quiet. That night, after my son fell asleep clutching his favorite stuffed animal, I sat at the kitchen table again. Fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wasn't writing yet, I was preparing. Because if the school wouldn't listen to whispers, I would make sure they heard me loud and clear, and this time the silence wouldn't belong to my son. The meeting with the school was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, right after the final bell. I remember staring at the clock that day, every minute stretching longer than the last. My son sat at the kitchen table coloring quietly, his feet swinging just above the floor, unaware of how much rested on what I was about to do. I packed his snack, brushed his hair, and kissed his forehead before dropping him off, forcing a smile I didn't feel. The moment his classroom door closed behind him, my chest tightened. I hated that I couldn't protect him from what waited inside those walls. By the time I arrived at the school office that afternoon, my hands were shaking. I told myself to breathe, to stay calm, to be polite. I reminded myself that adults listen better when you weren't emotional, that credibility mattered more than anger. Still, my heart pounded as I was led into a small conference room with beige walls and a long table scarred by years of meetings just like this. Across from me sat the teacher, her posture rigid, lips pressed into a thin line. Beside her was the vice principal, hands folded neatly, expression unreadable. They thanked me for coming. I thanked them for meeting with me. The teacher avoided my eyes. I began carefully, explaining what my son had told me, choosing my words like stepping stones across a river. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply described the incident as my son had experienced it, the laughter, the comment, the way it made him feel. I watched their faces closely, hoping to see concern, empathy, anything that suggested they understood the weight of what had happened. Instead, the teacher sighed. She said she didn't remember saying anything like that. She said children often misunderstood tone. She said classroom management required firmness. She said my son was sensitive. She said perhaps he had taken something the wrong way. Each sentence landed like a slap. The vice principal nodded occasionally, offering vague reassurances about maintaining a positive learning environment. They thanked me again for bringing my concerns forward. They said they would monitor the situation. They said it was important to trust the professionals. Trust. That word burned. I left the meeting feeling smaller than when I entered. Not because I doubted myself, but because I could see how easily truth could be buried under polite language and professional courtesy. As I walked down the hallway toward the exit, I passed classrooms filled with children laughing, learning, trusting. I wondered how many of them were carrying stories they hadn't told yet. That evening, my son asked how the meeting went. I told him they were going to keep an eye on things. It was a half-truth. The worst kind. The days that followed were worse than before. Subtle things changed. My son told me his desk had been moved farther from the front. He said the teacher corrected him more sharply now. He said she rarely smiled at him anymore. He started asking to stay home, claiming stomach aches, headaches, anything that might keep him away. I took him to the doctor. Nothing was wrong physically, but something was very wrong. His confidence eroded quickly, like sand slipping through fingers. He stopped reading aloud at home altogether. When I suggested practicing together, he shook his head and said, "I don't want to mess up." I began documenting everything. Every comment. Every behavior change. Every sleepless night. I wrote dates, times, exact phrases. I saved emails. I took screenshots. I learned the language of policies and procedures, reading through school district guidelines late into the night while the house slept. I requested another meeting. This time, the principal joined us. I came prepared. Notes in hand. Calm voice. Steady gaze. I laid out the pattern one had observed, the impact on my son, the documented behaviors that had followed the initial incident. I spoke not just as a mother, but as an advocate, as someone who understood. That silence only protected those with power. The principal listened, nodding slowly, occasionally jotting something down. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said she appreciated my thoroughness. She said they took these matters seriously. She said they would remind staff of appropriate conduct. Again, no acknowledgement of harm, no apology. No accountability. After that meeting, something shifted, not in the school, but in me. I realized then that this wasn't going to be resolved quietly. That the system was designed to protect itself first, even at the expense of a child's dignity. I realized that if I wanted change, I would have to force it into the light. My son's behavior continued to decline. He began wetting the bed again. Something he hadn't done in years. He clung to me in the mornings, his small hands gripping my coat like a lifeline. One night, I found him sitting on his bed in the dark, whispering to himself as he practiced reading a sentence over and over, his voice breaking with each mistake. I sat beside him and held him until he fell asleep. That night I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear me. Friends noticed the strain. My sister urged me to pull him out of the school. Another friend suggested therapy. I considered both, but something inside me resisted the idea of retreat. Why should my child have to leave? Why should he be the one to lose his place because an adult abused their authority? I reached out to other parents quietly, carefully. I asked questions without making accusations. Slowly, stories emerged. A child who had been called lazy. Another who had been embarrassed for asking for help. Small incidents brushed aside, dismissed as misunderstandings. But together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I wasn't alone. The realization strengthened me. I contacted the school district office next, escalating the issue. Beyond the building. The response was delayed. Formal, impersonal. They thanked me for my concern and informed me that an internal review would be conducted. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. One afternoon, my son came home with a note in his backpack. A behavior report. It cited disruptive behavior and lack of participation. I stared at the paper in disbelief. This was the same child who had been silenced for trying too hard, now punished for withdrawing. That was the moment something hardened completely. Inside me. I sat at the kitchen table that night, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I opened my laptop. I didn't type right away. I stared at the blank document, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen. I thought about my son's face when he asked me if he was stupid. I thought about the laughter in that classroom. I thought about every meeting that ended with empty promises, and then I began to write, not an email, not a complaint form, a letter. I wrote about my son, about his love for learning before this happened, about the child he was becoming before shame was introduced into his world. I wrote about the incident in detail, about the aftermath, about the silence that followed my attempts to address it privately. I wrote about the responsibility schools have not just to educate, but to protect. I didn't use names. I didn't insult. I didn't exaggerate. I told the truth. I wrote until my fingers ached and my eyes burned. I revised. I refined. I made sure every word carried weight, every sentence grounded in fact and feeling. This letter wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. When I finished, I read it aloud to myself, and I knew this letter would not be ignored. I didn't send it right away. I waited. I consulted an advocate. I reviewed district policies. I made sure every claim was supported. I made sure my son's identity was protected. I prepared myself for backlash, for dismissal, for the possibility that this could make things worse before they got better. But I also knew that silence was no longer an option. The next morning, my son hugged me tightly before school. "Do I have to talk today?" he asked. "No," I said softly. "You just have to be you." As I watched him walk away, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had done everything quietly, respectfully by the book. Now, I was ready to be heard, because the next step would change everything. And once the letter left my hands, the silence would belong to the school, not my child. I sent the letter on a Monday morning. I remember hovering over the send button longer than I care to admit. My coffee had gone cold beside me and my son was already at school. That felt important somehow, like once the letter left my hands, there would be no shielding him from whatever came next. Still, I pressed send. The screen blinked. The message disappeared into the void. The quiet battle I'd been fighting alone stepped into something much larger. The first response came within hours. Not from the school. From another parent. She didn't sign her full name, just her first. She said she'd received the letter because it had been forwarded quietly through a parent group. She said she was shaking as she read it. She said her daughter had come home crying more than once, but had begged her not to say anything because she didn't want to be labeled difficult. She ended the message with, "Thank you for writing what the rest of us were too afraid to say." By that evening, 3 more messages arrived, then 5. Then 10. Parents shared stories that felt eerily familiar. Children who suddenly hated school. Kids who stopped raising their hands. Bright personalities dulled by embarrassment. Some incidents were small on their own, easy to dismiss. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The next morning, the school called. The principal's voice was tight, professional, but no longer calm. She asked if I had distributed the letter publicly. I told her the truth. I had sent it only to the district and requested a formal response. What happened after that was beyond my control. She said they were concerned about misinformation. She said the situation was being blown out of proportion. My son came home quieter than usual. He went straight to his room without asking for a snack. I found him later sitting on his bed, backpack still on. He said suddenly, "I didn't know whether to feel relieved or furious." The kindness felt performative, like a bandage slapped over something infected. I knew enough by then to recognize damage control when I saw it. Polished language. They acknowledged receipt of my concerns and informed me that an investigation would begin immediately. They asked for a meeting. They asked for documentation. I sent everything. Every note, every email, every date and time. I attached screenshots, behavior reports, my own journal entries. Written at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. I sent it all without commentary, letting the evidence speak for itself. The investigation began quietly, but the tension inside the school was palpable. Teachers avoided eye contact. The teacher in question barely spoke to me during pickup. My son noticed the change before I did. Why is everyone whispering? Accepting the answer easily. Trusting me the way children do when. The story leaked beyond the school community. Someone shared the letter online, not with names, not with accusations, but with enough detail that people recognized themselves in it. Comments poured in. Former students spoke about lasting. Ignored them at first. Then my son came home with red eyes. He hadn't been mocked that day. He hadn't been singled out. Instead, another child had been. And everyone had laughed. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked me quietly. I had no answer that wouldn't break him. So I told the truth in the only way I could. I told him that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes other grown-ups are too slow to fix them, but that didn't mean it was okay. And it didn't mean we stopped trying. The next morning, I called the reporter back. The interview was careful. I spoke calmly, deliberately. I refused to name the teacher. I refused to speculate. I spoke only about impact, about what happens when authority is used without compassion, about the long shadow humiliation casts over learning. The piece ran 2 days later. The headline was, "Gentler than I expected." But the effect was immediate. The school district released a statement within hours. They announced mandatory sensitivity training. They placed the teacher on temporary leave pending the outcome of the investigation. My phone rang nonstop. Some messages were supportive. A few accused me of overreacting, of trying to ruin someone's career, of turning a small incident into a public spectacle. I read them all. Then I put my phone down and sat with my son while he did his homework. For the first, he read aloud without hesitation. The investigation concluded 3 weeks later. The district found that the teacher's conduct had violated professional standards. They cited multiple incidents corroborated by student accounts and parental testimony. Disciplinary action was taken. Details were kept confidential, but the message was clear. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't evasive. It was heavy with accountability. The school held an assembly about respect. Counselors were brought in. Parents were invited to forums. The culture began to shift, not perfectly, not instantly, but visibly. My son noticed. The bedwetting stopped. Slowly, carefully, my child began to come back to himself. One evening, weeks later, I found the letter printed out and folded neatly in my son's desk drawer. "Why do you have that?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "So I remember you stood up for me." I sat on his bed and cried openly this time, not because I was sad, but because I was proud. Proud of him for surviving something that never should have happened. Proud of myself for refusing to accept silence as the price of peace. Proud of every parent who had whispered "me too" and then found their voice. The school never apologized directly. They didn't have to. The change was apology enough. Sometimes, people ask me if I'd do it again, knowing the stress, the fear, the backlash. I always think of that moment, my son asking if he was stupid, my heart breaking in half, and I know the answer. Yes. Every time. Because no child should learn shame before they learn safety, and no parent should ever be made to feel like protecting their child is an inconvenience. The silence was broken, and it stayed broken. The silence didn't come immediately. At first, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath, unsure of which direction to move next. The meetings had ended. The letter had been read. The administration had retreated behind closed doors, and yet nothing felt resolved. Not yet. Silence, I learned, doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's the echo left behind after something powerful has been said. Every morning after that, I watched my son more closely than ever before. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I was trying to understand how deeply the damage had gone. Children don't always articulate pain the way adults do. They carry it quietly. They tuck it into the corners of their behavior, their posture, the way they hesitate before speaking. He woke up earlier than usual those first few weeks. Not excited, just alert. His body had learned vigilance. Trauma does. That, it rewires the nervous system, teaches even the smallest child that safety is conditional. I made breakfast like always. Toast, eggs, the same cereal he used to love before school became something he feared. He ate slowly, carefully, like he didn't want to take up too much space. That broke me in ways I can't fully explain. No child should ever feel like their presence is a burden. The drive to school was quiet. Not the comfortable kind, the heavy kind. The kind where words hover between you but don't quite land. As we pulled into the drop-off lane, I noticed his hands tighten around the straps of his backpack. "Mom?" he asked softly. "Yes? What if they laugh again?" I parked the car. I turned to face him fully, and I told him the truth, not a comforting lie, not a dramatic promise. The truth. "Then we deal with it together," I said. "You will never face that alone again. Ever." He nodded, not fully convinced, but willing to try. That was the beginning of our rebuilding. Inside the school, things were changing quietly, deliberately. The teacher who had mocked my son was absent, not announced, not explained, just gone. Substitute teachers rotated in. Schedules shifted. Children noticed more. My son noticed, but he didn't ask questions. The administration reached out again, requesting another meeting. No rehearsed phrases. Just careful words, spoken slower than before. They wanted to understand impact. So I told them. I told them about the nights my son cried himself to sleep. About the mornings he begged to stay home. About the way his confidence had evaporated. After being mocked by the one person who was supposed to protect him, I told them something else too, something they weren't expecting. "This isn't about one teacher," I said calmly. "It's about a culture that allows harm to hide behind authority." You could feel the room shift. Because the truth makes people uncomfortable before it makes them better. They asked what I wanted. I didn't ask for revenge. Training. Safeguards. Systems that protect children, instead of silencing them. And I asked them to remember something crucial. Children are not resilient because they endure pain. They're resilient when adults refuse to let pain define them. After that meeting, the silence changed. It was no longer avoidance. It was reflection. Weeks passed. Slowly, life began to reassemble itself. My son started volunteering to read aloud again, at first quietly, then louder. He raised his hand once, then twice. His teacher knew. Gentle. Observant, waited patiently when he stumbled, never rushing him, never correcting him publicly. At home, we celebrated small victories like they were milestones. The first day he came home smiling. The first time he talked about a classmate again. The first night he fell asleep without nightmares. Healing doesn't announce itself. It whispers. One evening, while folding laundry, I overheard him explaining a math problem to his younger cousin. Patient. Clear. Confident. The same child who had been mocked for not understanding was now teaching someone else. I had to step into the bathroom so he wouldn't see me cry. Because that's what cruelty steals potential. And that's what protection restores. The school eventually sent a formal acknowledgement, carefully worded, legally cautious, but sincere enough to matter. New policies were implemented. Staff underwent training. Students were encouraged to report concerns safely. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And sometimes, progress is the bravest thing an institution can offer. As months passed, other parents began reaching out. Quiet messages at first, then longer ones. Stories poured in, children shamed for learning differences, dismissed for speaking up, laughed at by those meant to guide them. "I thought it was just us," one parent wrote. Not as a hero, not as an expert, but as a parent who understood. Because silence thrives on isolation. And stories. Break it. My son noticed the changes too, not just in himself, but in the environment around him. Teachers were more careful with their words. Classrooms felt calmer. Mistakes were treated as part of learning instead of proof of failure. One afternoon, while walking home, he asked me something I'll never forget. "Mom, Why did you write that letter? Because, I said, when someone hurts you and you stay silent, they think it's okay. And it wasn't okay. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I'm glad you didn't stay quiet. So was I, because staying quiet would have been easier. But easier isn't always right. There were still hard days. Days when old fears resurfaced. Days when confidence wavered. Healing isn't linear. It loops, stumbles, pauses. But now, when those moments came, my son knew something fundamental. He was believed. He was protected. He mattered. And I changed too. I stopped doubting my instincts, stopped minimizing concerns, stopped apologizing for advocating. I learned that being nice is not the same as being effective. That courage doesn't roar, it persists. 1 year later, the school held a small assembly about kindness and respect. Nothing dramatic. Just stories, reminders, quiet commitments. As I sat in the audience, watching my son stand among his peers, head held high, eyes steady, I felt something close to peace. Not because the past was erased, but because it no longer controlled us, the teacher who mocked him. They became a reminder that authority must be accountable, that children deserve dignity. At home that night, as I tucked my son into bed, he wrapped his arms around my neck. Thank you for protecting me, he whispered. Because this story was never about making a school go silent. It was about making a child feel safe enough to speak again. And if you're listening, your child's dignity matters. And silence is never more powerful than truth. And if you've ever stood up for your child or wish you had, share your story in the comments. You never know who needs your courage today.